this type of violence inflicted, there's a certain level of depravity involved.
A brutal killing.
She's having a wonderful weekend with her family, then she's gone. Her life here on Earth was over.
I try not to think about how she died.
Bad things happen to good people, unfortunately.
A dark mystery with multiple suspects.
Was this a neighbor? Was it a coworker? Was it an ex-boyfriend? We weren't sure exactly what happened.
He was telling them that he was on the run and had murdered a woman in Florida.
If he had a clear view of her home, he would have known that she lived alone.
The truth will be revealed.
My gut was telling me that this was the person who murdered Bernadette Myers.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Sunshine City. That's how locals describe St. Petersburg, Florida.
I think what makes the whole area great here is the fact of the beautiful beaches that we have and the weather. You can do pretty much what you want year-round here in Pinellas County.
It's really considered a really hip and cool place to be nowadays. You get a lot of what I refer to as paradise people that come down for an easy life.
But wherever you have sunshine, you also have shadows.
The Loma neighborhood definitely had seen its better days.
It's an area where it's not unusual to see transients moving in and out.
Here, the home of Bernadette Myers stands out.
Bernadette's home was the nicest one on the block. And she cared a lot about her home, and you could see it.
Bernadette did not show up for work that day, and Bernadette did not answer her phone and did not return any phone calls that had been previously left for her. So one of her friends decided to drive over to Bernadette's house, and she looked in through the kitchen windows, and she was able to see what to her appeared to be something red, possibly blood, on the floor in the kitchen.
Detectives Judy Vauvin and Larry Nelvin arrive on scene within minutes.
We could see large amounts of blood in the kitchen. We could see the drag marks that went from the kitchen dining room area into the bedroom.
And going into the master bedroom, we found Bernadette Myers face down on the floor with a large amount of blood dried around her head. Her hands were behind her back, duct tape around the wrist, and she had 2 large zip ties put around her neck, and they were cinched up as tight as they could possibly be. Her cause of death was the ligature strangulation. The blunt force trauma to her head was secondary to the asphyxiation. That tells you that Bernadette Myers was alive when those zip ties were put on her neck and cinched up, and when she was drugged into her room and left there.
That was certainly the first murder investigation that I worked at. The zip ties were utilized as an instrument of death. The physicality of it itself was extremely brutal.
Detectives now face the difficult task of breaking the news to loved ones.
Making a death notification to a family member is a very hard thing to do. You're trying to establish whatever you can about your victim from these people that you just shattered and shook up their life.
I remember the moment that they told us, it was just disbelief. It was just a whirlwind of not knowing what took place or what happened. The weekend before she passed away, we were all together in Ocala. It was the entire family, Sunday morning. We were all sitting around. Everybody just laughed and just joked around, and really that was the atmosphere that we had. One of the last pictures that were taken of her, she was holding her great niece and her great nephew. It's a loving moment.
It struck your heart. You know, she's there, she's having a wonderful weekend with her family, and then she's gone. Her life here on Earth was over.
She had a son. She had a lot of friends and relatives that she would see on a pretty regular basis.
She was a good family member. She was a good friend.
Monday, I called her because we would always talk about the weekend, and we would laugh and joke and talk about the things that had happened. I called and left her a message. And because of the time frame, I sometimes wonder when that message was being heard.
We spoke to ex-boyfriends, we spoke to co-workers, we spoke to anyone and everyone that could lead us down the road to the killer. We weren't able to find anyone that had anything bad to say about her, or anyone certainly that had threatened her in any way.
Bad things happen to good people, unfortunately.
Determined to fill in the last 24 hours of her life, police interview Bernadette's colleague, who first spotted the blood.
Her friend was very upset, very emotional, but she provided us a lot of good information to help build a timeline. Bernadette worked at Honeywell. They work on parts for the military as well as stuff for the space program. She was an intelligent person, a hard worker. She was an early riser, got to work early, left work, and she was done for the day. We learned that on the Monday, she left work around 2:30 or 3. She had a doctor's appointment, and we know she made it there. We knew that she had a problem with one of her tires. She went to an auto parts store at around 4:30. She was there for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then she left. Sometime around 5 o'clock is most likely when she got home.
Clues from the scene suggest she met her killer moments afterwards.
There was like a bag of oranges that were out on the table. Bernadette would have put those away. I mean, that's not something she would leave out. She was very neat, which would imply that she was interrupted in whatever she did as soon as she got home.
Due to the fact that she had not returned any calls and put her groceries away or changed her clothes, we feel that she was murdered somewhere between 5 and 7 o'clock at the latest on Monday.
There was no kicked-in door, there were no screens missing, there were no broken windows. We did think perhaps that our perpetrator was someone that she knew or someone that was familiar with her home. We know that just based on the brutality at the scene, that more than likely it was going to be a man.
There was no DNA of interest found at the scene. And by that I mean they would have found, of course, Bernadette's DNA, which as you would expect.
Not one fingerprint, but one of the forensic examiners at the scene, who was still in the middle of processing, was able to develop a bloody shoe impression on the floor that they were able to enhance using chemicals. We knew it wasn't Bernadette's. Her shoes were on the kitchen floor, and she was knocked out of them. So we felt very strong that this was going to be the bloody shoe impression from the murderer.
The actual impression was believed to be some type of tennis shoe, and the size between 9 and 11.
Her vehicle was not in the garage. So, of course, what I'm going to surmise from that is that whoever murdered her stole her car. Did they steal it because they wanted the car, or did they steal it because they thought it was the best way to get away from that location without being seen? It seemed pretty organized. He was either more prepared than your normal person, or he was able to react somewhat calm after he had done this to figure out how he's going to get out of there. We're looking for anybody and everybody that's associated with Bernadette, that's associated with the area, that would have any reason to be there. My first instinct was this was something that was sexually motivated.
Some of her underwear apparently had been taken out of her dresser, which could be Bernadette doing her laundry, or it could be a fetish, type sex aspect to it.
We have a sexual predator offender tracking unit here at the sheriff's office. They track all the locations of all the sex offenders and sex predators, and they're required to check in and register with them.
The investigators would automatically search the database for any persons in the area that are sexual predators. They would be persons of interest to speak to as soon as possible.
There is one name at the top of their list.
Leo Broby was brought to our attention by the sexual predator unit. He was a convicted sexual predator who had committed a violent rape.
He lived within around a mile of Bernadette Myers. His offenses had to do with adult women.
There's some leopards out there with spots on that don't change.
So, of course, we wanted to look into him, try to find out where he might have been on the day that Bernadette was murdered.
The lead suspect in Bernadette Myers' homicide is a convicted sex offender.
So we wanted to find him and talk with him to try and establish a timeline.
If somebody is determined by police to have a record for sexual assault, especially if it's a record for violence and sexual assault, they are examined more thoroughly by police to see if they're capable of committing an even worse assault, and in this case, that would be murder.
Police obtained Broby's address from the offender tracking unit.
In my being, I knew he was a dirtbag. When we spoke to Mr. Broby, he had recently injured himself.
He said he had suffered a broken foot previously and had to use the crutches to get around on. I think it would have been very hard for somebody that truly has to use crutches to be able to do what was done to Bernadette. But we still wanted to make every effort to make sure he wasn't just using that as a crutch. We were able to timeline his injury out by talking to his place of employment, and they were able to confirm with us that he had had this injury prior to Bernadette's murder.
He got out of work that afternoon at 3:30, and he had to wait for a ride. So as far as the timeline goes, he wouldn't have been able to make it from where he was to Bernadette's house to commit the murder because of the physical injury.
To be certain, detectives turned to the forensic evidence.
When we got the autopsy results, it was determined that there was no sexual assault to Bernadette Myers. So all of that was against Leo Broby being involved in this. We were able to rule him out as being a suspect in this homicide. Now that we knew that she was not the victim of a sexual assault, obviously the person went through something in her room and was searching for something.
Detective Nalvin and I invited Michelle and Christopher, that's Bernadette's niece and her son, to come to the house to hopefully be able to assist us. As hard as it was, we were hoping that they were going to be able to give us some key information in regards to the items that were missing, that we couldn't recognize as being missing because we had never been in that home before.
Everything had its place at Aunt Bernadette's house. Bernadette kept a very, very nice house. You could eat off her floor.
It was very emotional for them. It was extremely emotional. But they put their grief aside, and they were very focused on helping us find the killer.
At first, they really couldn't tell if anything was missing until her son said, I think that my mom had a wooden jewelry box on her dresser top.
There was several items of jewelry that she kept in that jewelry box.
Some items that they said were very unique, and that's what we kind of focused in on at that point in time.
Christopher drew pictures of the jewelry for us, but also Michelle, her niece, brought in a photograph of Bernadette from the family gathering that happened in Ocala the weekend before her murder. Bernadette was wearing a two-tone Ancline watch in the photograph, and it was on her wrist. And that was a watch that we did not find at the crime scene.
If you can identify property that's been stolen from a residence, it's a very valuable lead for the police because you can trace back who possessed that property to prove that the suspect was in the house.
That kind of explained potentially the undergarments that were on the bed and on the floor. We felt that the person went through the drawers looking for more jewelry or money or something of value. Her house was almost like a little bit of an oasis in the middle of this area. So people might think that this person, because they take care of their house, has money or has valuables inside of there. There's all kinds of people going by that residence all the time. It's a very heavily traveled road. So you start thinking, was somebody staking out her residence?
Investigators focus on the area surrounding Bernadette's house, looking for anything out of the ordinary.
We received a phone call from my sergeant at the time, who was out in an alley that runs behind Bernadette Meyer's house. And he said he was with an individual and that we needed to come meet with them. And that's when we first encountered Lee Davy. Lee Davy happened to be walking down the alley as my sergeant was walking down the alley, and he sees Lee approaching him, holding in his hand about a 34 to 36 inch long zip tie.
Davy is also found walking in the alley at the same time of day Bernadette was killed.
So the proximity is there, he's got the zip tie, and he certainly looks like he would be a strong enough individual that could have exerted the amount of violence on Bernadette.
He was a person of interest to us, a very strong person of interest.
In my mind, I'm thinking, this could be our killer.
Detectives have identified a man named Lee Davy, found carrying zip ties near Bernadette Meyer's house.
Of course, he knows who she is because he sits at the bus stop across from her house. He lives across the street. He walks the alley.
So of course, we're assessing him, we're looking at his feet. Does he wear the same size tennis shoes? His mannerism, is he perspiring?
He brought us over to his apartment that he lived in, let us search through his whole entire apartment, let us look at all his shoes.
He actually was cooperative with us. But sometimes that's not unusual because sometimes the bad guys think they're gonna outsmart you.
Lee claims to have been at work in the time frame Bernadette was killed.
People will lie. Very, very dangerous to accept at face value that what you're being told is entirely the truth. Your job is to take the information, try to corroborate what you're being told.
He didn't have a violent history, so there was no motive there.
His shoe size was smaller than that we were looking for, that the killer had left behind.
And there was nothing that tied him to Bernadette.
His alibi also checks out.
The zip tie, he indicates that he found it near the bus station down in St. Pete, which is a distance away, and he grabbed it and just walked home with it. So for his case, I think it's a matter of timing. Bad timing for him to be walking down the alley carrying a zip tie.
When you have a person of interest that you believe could have committed this crime, you are putting all your efforts into that. And then once it gets to the point that you are able to confirm that this person, in fact, was not the killer, it's a little disappointing. But that's the truth of it. Word had spread in the neighborhood because of the crime scene tape being there. Word had spread at her job. So people were calling in as well and giving us information, giving us leads. There was a phone call from a woman named Sunshine. Sunshine was very well known in the law enforcement community in the Lellman area. She was very familiar with the streets because at times she lived on them. She had had some run-ins with the law herself. So we certainly knew exactly who she was. And she called in and provided us some information that she'd seen a black male in the alley right before the time of Bernadette's death.
She also said she saw the same person run through Bernadette's yard and then saw that person at a convenience store down the street later. So we went out and met with that convenience store. But there's no surveillance footage because their equipment's not working.
They were panning for gold there, just, sifting through everything, trying to figure out where's this going to take us. When you really have nothing and you're just searching, one of the things you'd say, well, is anybody doing burglaries around that time frame? You start looking for any creep-in burglaries or people are at home, because the vast majority of home burglaries, there's nobody at home. And burglars don't want to break into people's houses when people are there.
It led us to Curtis Bryant.
He became a person of interest because, that was kind of his MO, going to people's houses in that area and breaking in while they were there.
Bryant's description matches that of the man seen by Sunshine near Bernadette's house.
In the process of finding Curtis Bryant, he was arrested on a burglary charge.
He broke into a residence while somebody was home, and it happened to be a female, an adult female, in close proximity to Bernadette's residence, within 8 blocks, and they were also in a stolen car.
So when Detective Nalvin and I had the opportunity to interview him about Bernadette's death, he was actually in custody. Unfortunately, that day, Mr. Bryant lacked a moral compass.
He listened to us talk, but he refused to answer specific questions, and at one point he ended up telling us he didn't want to talk anymore.
Well, if I'm his lawyer, the first thing I tell him to do is, you do not talk to the police, ever. And if you do, you're an idiot. Because anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
They search Bryant's house, hoping to uncover evidence linking him to Bernadette's murder.
He lived in a little room inside of a garage and paid rent there. And we searched around in the garage.
We were looking for anything that may have been taken from the murder scene or brought to the murder scene.
We found duct tape. We found some decent length zip ties, pretty close to the length of the ones that we had on Bernadette Myers. However, the zip ties was a different manufacturer. The duct tape had a different grain and texture to it. We collected his shoes. His shoe size did not appear to fit with the size of the impression that we had. Nothing was tying him to her. Nothing was tying him to the scene.
Bryant looks set to be ruled out when police make an important discovery.
When we found Bernadette's car, it was at a local auto parts store right around the corner from Bernadette's. That was somewhat exciting to hear. Finding the car where it was in such close proximity, it kind of supported the theory that we had that the person got in the car to get away from her residence without being seen.
They look for physical evidence that places him in the vehicle.
We were hoping we'd get lucky and get DNA from the suspect. We had it towed back to our forensic lab, and it was processed. They were able to recover blood from the top of the steering wheel, from the gear shifter. They recovered it from the armrest. We had it submitted to the crime lab in hopes of it belonging to the suspect. However, all of that came back to Bernadette Myers. It's very deflating every time you're sending something off that you feel has a good potential of having DNA associated to the suspect, and it's coming back to your victim.
Their final hope in connecting Bryant to Bernadette lies with the timeline.
At that point in time, when Bernadette was murdered, Curtis worked for a seawall construction company, and we were able to get in touch with his boss, and we were able to confirm that he was at work and what time they worked till that day, which would have made it impossible for him to make it from where he was to Bernadette's for that.
Detectives now worry about the case growing cold.
Morale was kind of stretched, but you keep pushing ahead. You know, you have a victim that you want to find justice for her, and you have family members.
I mostly remember how I always felt they were going to catch the person that did this. I really, really felt strongly that they were going to do that. I don't think they turned it off ever. I think that they carried the weight of this case until it was done. So we were able to really put our grief aside and put all our faith in them.
Convinced Bernadette's murder was a well-planned crime of opportunity, police broadened their neighborhood search, determined to identify anything unusual from her final 24 hours.
In Bernadette's case, what made it unique and somewhat difficult was the fact that it was a transient area. It's a lot of people coming and going. We went back out again to do some more canvassing, and there was a decent-sized auto dealership right at the end of Bernadette Street. We talked to an employee, and she had some very good information for us. Going back to Monday, the day that we know Bernadette was murdered, she was parked across the street on the north side of the road, and at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she saw an individual standing next to a van that was parked next to her car. 30-year-old white male, 5'10", brown hair. She got in her car and she left. She came back about 45 minutes later. And when she came back, the van was still there.
And the interesting thing is that how he was parked, if he looked down the street, he could see Bernadette's home.
It was in direct sight of Bernadette's residence, with the front door and the driveway and most of her yard. I thought, great, maybe this person was looking that direction and could remember seeing something happen at Bernadette's residence. The individual was now seated inside the van, and as she got out, he made a comment to her without her even saying a word to him. "I'm waiting to meet somebody." He volunteers that to her, which she thought was kind of weird. And she goes into work. And about 15 minutes later, which would now be about 5 o'clock, she goes to leave for the day. He's still there. I asked her if there's anything that stood out about the van, and she remembered that it had a magnet on the side of the van from a local painting company.
This was something certainly that we had to follow up on. Who was he? Was there a line from him to Bernadette? Was this someone that Bernadette knew? Because of the business name on the side of the van, we knew where we were going to go next. And we were going to find out who was this person in this van.
Investigators on the Bernadette Myers case worked to track down a mystery man seen outside her home on the day of the murder.
So we went and found the owner of the painting company. And the owner is very good friends of Bernadette Myers. So that struck a chord. He informed us that he himself had painted the inside her residence about 4 years prior. And then 3 years ago, the outside of her residence was painted by 2 of his workers. One of them who was currently incarcerated in prison, and the other one was named Charles Hall.
Detectives bring Hall in for an interview.
He told me and confirmed that he did paint her house 3-4 years ago, as he remembered it. Said it took about a week to paint it. He kind of alluded that they were kind of friendly when he painted her house, that she would leave her doors unlocked so they could use the restroom. So I asked him if he had been by there recently. And he said no. And I said, well, you sure? Sure you wouldn't have been somewhere around there to meet somebody? And he kind of said, oh, yeah, I was. He kind of committed to parking in the same area that he was observed in.
He reluctantly admitted that he was there, knowing that there was probably a witness that saw him there.
I asked him for his help to see if he saw anybody over there, and he said, yeah, I could see right to her house, but no, I didn't see anybody. He was thinking out loud at this point to himself, who was I there to meet? Who was it? And he was looking up into the ceiling and looking left and looking right, and he kind of just looked over at us and said, I don't know, beats me. I can't remember who it was. He parked in a spot, for an hour and waited to meet somebody, but can't remember who he was going to meet. I didn't believe him.
We did notice during the course of the interview that Mr. Holmes' shoe size looked like it could have been the shoe size that we were looking for, but there was no real evidence to hold him.
At that point in time, I'd gotten information from him that I could follow up on, and I sent him on his way, and asking him to call me when he thinks of who this alleged person was that he was supposed to meet. We put our surveillance team on him to establish where he's going and coming and who he's associating with so we can start talking to them.
When you're a seasoned investigator and you have to allow them to go, it's gut-wrenching. Not everyone can work homicide. It's very demanding, and it can be incredibly stressful. You have to be able to shift gears very quickly, and you have to have a really strong belief in the law and in justice.
As they begin the follow-up on Holm, the investigation takes a bizarre turn.
There was bulletins that were put out about the circumstances of her death to other law enforcement agencies.
We get a call from Alma Police Department in Arkansas about an individual who they called a hitchhiker that had been dropped off by some people because he was telling them that he was on the run and had murdered a woman in Florida. When law enforcement in Arkansas had contact with him, in going through the stuff, he had some zip ties.
It's a coincidence they can't ignore. So they work towards linking the man to Bernadette.
By going through all these different reports and different associates surrounding this individual, we are able to see at one point in time that a girlfriend of his that lived almost on the same block as Bernadette Myers.
They discover an incident report revealing the hitchhiker had a violent past.
He had been involved in a shooting and kidnapping, so to speak, with an ex-girlfriend or ex-wife. So you see that there's a violent tendency from this unstable person. And then you have the fact that he's saying he murdered a woman in Florida. We are doing everything we can to try and establish where he's been for this time, because he wasn't with the people that he was hitchhiking with anymore, and law enforcement had already sent him on his way, and now he was in the wind. It was very frustrating.
They work to place their new suspect in Bernadette's neighborhood at the time she was killed.
If you can get the timeline right, you can prove or break the suspect's alibi.
We found evidence he was in some facility in Tennessee during the time frame of Bernadette's murder. There was nothing put in him in this area recently. As this investigation went on, it seemed that everybody we came into contact with now all of a sudden is either carrying a zip tie or has them in their garage. None of them were the size of the ones that we found on Bernadette. You want tips to come in, but it depends. Sometimes you get a lot that don't lead you anywhere. Some are good, but you can't pick and choose which ones you get, so you have to work all of them.
The investigation gains new traction when the surveillance team makes an important discovery about painter Charles Hom.
We learned that he was a frequent pawner. A lot of his pawn activity was tools and construction equipment, things of that nature. In Florida, when you pawn anything, you're required to, 1, provide a photo ID, and 2, you're required to provide a thumbprint. If we have any suspicion that could have been a robbery or burglary, you're going to look for somebody pawning this stuff to get the money for it.
Detective Nelvin checks Holmes' most recent pawn activity.
After Bernadette Myers' murder, he pawned some women's jewelry.
We traveled to the pawn shops. And based on the drawings by Christopher, we were able to determine that there were several items pawned by Mr. Hom that belonged to Bernadette. These items were sent to the lab for a DNA test.
On the pink coral ring was our one piece of DNA evidence that belonged to Bernadette Myers, which proved that that was her ring. And the concerning part about it is that we're finding that in one particular transaction, he was pawning this before we'd even found her body inside her house on Tuesday.
That was a true breaking point.
With the circumstantial evidence mounting against Charles Hom, detectives are able to subpoena more of his records from the day of the murder.
We got his phone records, and we're able to see what I would describe as a frantic attempt to get a hold of a friend of his named Gary.
It shows a flurry of phone calls, like I think it's 6:20 or 6:22 that evening.
The calls fall right within the time frame of Bernadette's murder, making Gary their next priority.
Gary told us that he was friends with Charles Hom, and he also told us that he had gotten some jewelry from Charles. He also told us that his wife had some of the jewelry. So at that point in time, we go find his wife, Kimber. As I looked at the watch that she's wearing on her wrist, immediately flashed this picture that the family had provided to me of when Bernadette was in Ocala one day before she was murdered.
She was actually wearing Bernadette's watch. There's a part of me that thought that, there was some divine intervention happening there. That's one of those moments that you pray for.
I think the stars just aligned with us having the weekend together, and it was just such a beautiful weekend, but that we had the picture of the watch.
As Charles Hom is charged with first-degree murder, detectives can now identify the critical details from Bernadette's final 24 hours and the events that drew her ever closer to a desperate killer.
The day before, Bernadette had been with her son visiting some relatives in Ocala.
Bernadette came home Sunday evening. She went to work on Monday.
She stopped a couple places on her way home for errands.
Charles Hom sat in his van for an hour waiting for her to get home. He knows that she has a nice house. He knows where she works, so he knows that she's more well off than most people in that area.
Now, whether when he was watching her house, his plan was to kill her, it's possible. He was doing a lot of drugs at that time. Heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine.
She went home that night expecting to have a quiet evening. She put her things down, and Mr. Hom was at the back door. And she probably answered it. She was a friendly person. And she recognized him.
And he probably thought he might be able to smooth talk her into getting some money. But she will tell people her mind. Probably told him to pack sand. He was upset. That's when he attacks her.
He repeatedly struck her in the back of the head with some type of blunt weapon. And he continued to strike her until she went down. To make sure that she was not going to be on this earth any longer, then he took zip ties and he put them around her neck and used those zip ties to drag her body from the kitchen area into her bedroom, where he left her face down with her head in a pool of blood.
He was panicked at some point because he was trying to reach out to his friend Gary at that point in time, frantically. He then used the idea of going through her garage to get in her car to leave without being seen, to go park down the street, to be able to walk back to his van that he was in, and then drive away. Then, the following day, Charles Halm pawned jewelry that belonged to Bernadette Myers 3 hours before we found her. Finding the pawn transaction that's done before her body's found with the jewelry that we know is hers, and then finding this watch that she was wearing not even 24 hours before she was murdered, to me was a huge moment.
He probably looked at it as she could be an easy target as far as that goes. And so in that regard, it's not random. It's random from the standpoint that she did nothing to encourage this. And that's the scary part. You know, there truly are evil people out there that prey on innocent folks.
Ultimately, Charles Halm was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Bernadette Myers. He's serving life with no chance of parole. You're talking about a couple $100 ultimately. A couple highs is what he got out of this. Murdered her brutally. To think about somebody going through that in the last minutes of their life is always stuck in my memory. Being able to put Charles Halm in prison for the rest of his life was very satisfying.
There's parts of every homicide that you always have with you. The part about this case, about Bernadette Myers' death and her murder that stuck with me the most was the courage of her family, even at their time of grief, to help us with the investigation. Without their help, we wouldn't have been able to go forward.
I try not to think about how she died. I like to think about how she lived. Bernadette was so funny, and we laughed all the time. She was our aunt, she was a sister, she was a best friend. Sunday morning, we were all just sitting there visiting. And Bernadette was sitting next to me. And she looked me right in the eyes and told me why she loved me. It doesn't get any better than that.